This is Trevor Harrison welcoming you to the fifth lecture in Political Sociology, Sociology 3360 for Spring 2020. This lecture will be in two parts. In the first part, I will examine the ideas of Karl Polanyi contained in his celebrated book, The Great Transformation. In the second part, I will look at different forms of political authority, looking specifically at the ideas of classical political theorists, including Hobbes, Rousseau, and John Stuart Mill. You'll note a resonance in both these two discussions with ideas about politics and society in the works of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim and their assorted followers. Like last week, this lecture will generally follow the outline shown in PowerPoint 2. Like last week also, I encourage you to pour yourself a coffee or any other beverage of your choosing and get ready at your convenience to take in the lecture. To repeat, the first part of this lecture deals with the ideas of Karl Polanyi. In some earlier lectures, I began with a biography of the main theorists. I've done this because, as I discussed in the introductory lecture, in order for them to be understandable, ideas must also be placed in their historical, political, and social context. That is, ideas do not arise spontaneously at a given time, but are, as Marx would argue, the result of material factors. In this instance, we need to situate Polanyi's idea of the necessity of an embedded economy against the economic theory that had dominated since the early 19th century, classical liberal economics. And later in this battle of ideas, against those of Polanyi's chief competitor in the late 20th century, Friedrich Hayek. Slide 4 presents the ideas of two writers instrumental to the ideas of classical liberal economics, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. Liberal economics signals a shift that occurred in the late 18th and early 19th centuries as society moved from feudalism to capitalism and the growth of the modern state. The period leading up to the 19th century saw the gradual emergence of the modern state. The modern state grew out of city-states, places such as Genoa and Venice in Italy, into larger enterprises that, among other things, covered much vaster territories, larger and increasingly more urban populations, and internal markets. These geopolitical changes also involved class changes, particularly the rise of merchants whose economic power challenged the established authority of kings. A congruency of interests soon emerged between merchants and the aristocratic state. The merchants wanted to expand trade, to defeat challengers, and to be protected from these challengers. The state could provide the military and authoritative might to achieve this end. But the state, needing financing to achieve its own purposes, not least of which to wage war, also came increasingly to rely on the accumulating wealth of the merchants. The system that emerged during this period is known as mercantilism. A chief aim of mercantilism was to preserve the mother country's supply of precious metals and to make it less vulnerable during times of war. The possession of gold and silver was a measure of a country's wealth, hence the acquisition of colonies throughout the Americas and Asia, and eventually Africa. Such colonies also ensured the capture of other resources needed by the state's burgeoning populations. In the case of France, for example, fish stocks to feed the urbanizing centers. Thus, Europeans came to North America to catch the abundance of fish off Newfoundland. Thus, also, the persistence of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon as French islands that remain vestiges of early colonialism. The economic exploitation of the colonies was left to the merchants, who were generously given vast territories over which to rule with all the powers of the state. Such were the British and Dutch East Indian companies. Canada's own Hudson Bay Company was also a product of this period. But mercantilism had its problems. Just as we saw in the earlier lecture that slaves might revolt, only one of slavery's problems, so also those colonized are likely to become disenchanted in time with being governed from afar, The American Revolution proved this difficulty. The American Revolution added to growing criticisms within England. The colonies were not an altogether good thing. Besides endless conflict, there was the administrative cost of housing troops. You may remember that efforts to have the colonized pay for having English troops on their soil through taxation was a cause of the American Revolution. At this point, Adam Smith came along. Smith was born in 1723 into a relatively poor Scottish family. His father died 2 months before Smith was born. His mother encouraged Smith in education. In time, he became a noted philosopher and political economist, one of the scholars associated with the Scottish Enlightenment. He is best known for 2 books, Theory of Moral Sentiments, published in 1759, and The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, same year as the American Revolution. The 2 books harbor a much noted contradiction. Sentiments argues in favor of the notion of empathy, by which we develop a conscience, the notion of regarding the other. By contrast, Wealth argues in favor of self-interest. With Christmas only just behind us, we might note that Charles Dickens' Tale of Scrooge deals in human form this particular kind of opposition. Smith's ideas about the economy are regularly simplified for political reasons. One need only read publications of the Fraser Institute and similar pro-business think tanks and lobby groups to see this. Smith did not argue against regulation. For Smith, like Marx, the economy is a system, one governed by an invisible hand. But he does not deny there are bad merchants and bad practices that must be insured against. He warned repeatedly against the tendency towards corporate monopolies and the ill effects of the business class coming to dominate politics. Smith's arguments were a blow against mercantilism. Colonialism was not only politically unwise, but also economically inefficient. Mercantilism compelled the state to assure a market for goods produced in the colony. If not protected in this manner, then why have colonies? Why not buy where the price and quality was best? The new system emerging suggested that merchants as well as consumers would be better off in purchasing from any array of competing markets. These ideas were promoted further by David Ricardo. Ricardo built on Smith's ideas, most especially on the idea of specialization. Anticipating Durkheim's idea of a division of labor across occupations, Smith already noted how specialization and uniformity was a contributor to the increased production of goods. Factory production, even in Smith's day, was breaking down craft production and the power of guilds. The proletarianization of the worker, about which Marx would soon write, was well underway. Ricardo took it even further, emphasizing the specialization of production across countries. In one of his examples, he suggested England should specialize in producing clothing. It had a growing garment industry at the time based on jute coming from India, while Portugal should continue specializing in making pork. Overall, world production, argued Ricardo, would increase if everyone stuck to what they did best. Everyone would prosper. Ricardo's idea of comparative advantage lies at the heart of modern arguments in favor of laissez-faire, that is, free trade. It ignored the fact that England was well in advance of many countries in its industrial development. England continued to prosper, while Portugal remained poor. But Ricardo's idea of free trade found favor with the rising merchant class of England, the bourgeoisie. During the 19th century, no other countries wholly adopted free trade. Most, trying to catch up to England, adopted some measure of protectionism. The US was highly protectionist throughout the 19th century and still remains at times even in the 20th and 21st. In the longer run, however, Ricardo's ideas of unregulated markets found support among capitalists looking for international investment opportunities and not wishing to be held down by states. markets that functioned outside of human and political control, the invisible hand. Slide number 5 brings us to Friedrich Hayek. Hayek was an Austrian-Hungarian who had fought in the First World War on the side of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. The empire was already teetering before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 by a Serbian nationalist, which set off the war. In the aftermath of the war, Europe was rent by nationalist and ideological conflicts as old nations sought to have their own states, and between communism, liberalism, and fascism. Hayek was not a fascist, but he was very leery of all forms of collectivism, especially communism, and the state. His ideas on economics were forged amidst the chaos of the Great Depression and in opposition to the ideas of John Maynard Keynes. A very brief discussion of the Great Depression and its central causes is useful here. Boiled to its essence, the Depression arose out of two factors: mass production and an increasingly unequal distribution of wealth. Modern capitalism is built upon a virtuous cycle of production and consumption, supply and demand. Mass production was exemplified in the assembly lines that by the 1920s were launching an enormous number of cars and trucks and other goods. But fewer people were employed in making these products, and as Marx would have predicted, unemployment ensured that the wages for those still employed would be constantly ratcheted down. In early 1929, stock markets were booming, but the boom was illusory. In the real economy, unemployment and bankruptcy rates were rising. Mainstream politicians in Canada, the US, and elsewhere insisted that the economy was sound, even as unemployment rates soared into the low 30s in most capitalist countries. An economist, John Maynard Keynes, had a better idea, arguing that government had a necessary role in restoring purchasing power in the economy. In technical terms, increasing demand. This was done initially through a series of public works, building roads and bridges, for example, but would in time spread to such government programs as unemployment insurance, social allowance payments, and pensions, all of which put money in the hands of individuals and families who would spend it and therefore fuel the economy's recovery. Hayek, a member of the conservative Austrian School of Economics, criticized Keynes and Keynesianism. Hayek viewed government interventions as harmful to the economy in the long run, but also a danger to human freedom. In his book, The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944, he argued that all forms of government intervention would lead inevitably to state control and totalitarianism. Only the market, capitalism, could ensure personal freedom. Hayek's libertarian ideas remain a pillar of neoconservative and neoliberal thought today. He was an advisor to the Fraser Institute until his death. The Institute's much promoted Tax Freedom Day is a testament to Hayek's ideas. At last we come to Karl Polanyi. It perhaps seems a long journey, but I hope a worthwhile one. Like Hayek, Polanyi emerged out of the First World War, but unlike Hayek, his political leanings were social democratic, though he himself was never a communist. His wife, however, belonged to the Communist Party for a time, eventually preventing them from becoming United States citizens, much to Canada's benefit. The Polanyi family moved to Canada, where they became one of Canada's most illustrious families. Their daughter, Carrie Levitt Polanyi, became a distinguished political economist in her own right. At the risk of severe simplification, slide number 7 highlights Polanyi's key ideas. He argues in The Great Transformation, which came out in 1944, the same year as Hayek's book. He argues that the Second World War was caused directly and indirectly by a series of complex events going back to the 19th century that saw the deregulation of an increasingly global economic system. For Pliny, the idea of markets being self-regulating is a myth, and a dangerous myth at that. It is utopian, a term first used by Thomas More in his 1516 book about a self-contained island. The word is derived from Greek, but has two meanings, suggesting that More was engaging in a pun. First, utopos, no place or nowhere, and second, etopos, a good place. In other words, utopia is a good place, being also so very good because it is an imaginary place, one that does not and cannot exist. Unless regulated, says Pliny, markets are inherently destabilizing. The economy must always be embedded in society, functioning for society, and not the reverse. To allow otherwise is to result in political disorder and conflict, which Pliny summarizes in the term a double movement. The double movement consists of this. As market liberalism expands, social and political chaos ensues. Read again Marx and Engels' favorable discussion in the Communist Manifesto of the changes bourgeois capitalism has made in disrupting feudal society. Occupations are destroyed, communities disrupted, long-standing affiliations, relationships, and values tossed aside. But in response to this expansion, people, their communities, do what is natural and predictable. They turn inwards to protect themselves from the damage. Expansion and contraction are the two competing forces at work in the double movement. How do communities protect themselves? They seek out political leaders who will do so. We see in Pliny's argument the counter to Hayek's contention. For Hayek and his mentor, von Mises, economic freedom necessarily leads to political freedom. For Pliny, economic freedom in the manner described by Hayek leads to social disruption, pitting individuals, groups, and communities against each other. In his arguments, one can see similarities to Gramsci's notion of how economic crises lead to political and social crises. But Pliny does not altogether oppose markets. He simply wants them regulated in the interests of society, to work for society. Finally, Pliny, in some respects, returns to Adam Smith's earlier notion of markets having, of necessity, overtly moral premises connected to social relations. Slide number 8 summarizes several examples of communities moving to protect themselves during periods of market turmoil. Many of these leading directly to the Second World War were fascist in Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Germany, with significant support also in France, Britain, the United States, and Canada. But other examples can also be found. The Russian Revolution in 1917 and protectionism in the US immediately after the crash in 1929. In Canada, the emergence of populist, primarily agrarian movements in Western Canada, social credit in Alberta, and the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation in Saskatchewan. And, of course, workers' efforts to unionize throughout the 1930s and 40s are also indicators of a double movement. The slide also provides examples of more recent social and political movements that have arisen in the context of neoliberal efforts over the past 30 years to deregulate the world economy. It is in this context that slide number 9 shows why Pliny's ideas have been resurrected by a vast swath of political theorists and social commentators during the last 30 years to help explain the rise of social and political conflict. Why, in the words of the poet Yeats, also widely quoted in recent years, the center does not hold. The period after the Second World War saw a continued expansion of capitalist markets, but also protections offered through the welfare state, at least in the Western democracies, to citizens impacted by the market changes, such things as unemployment insurance, family benefits, and gradually increasing wages. But this period of regulated capitalism went into crisis in the 1970s as corporate profits declined. It was replaced by the 1980s with a new regime of capital accumulation, today termed neoliberalism. With the fall of Soviet communism in the late 1980s, capitalism, especially finance capital, seemed triumphant and unstoppable. Riffing on Hegel, an American political theorist, Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History and the Last Man, published in 1993. The book extolled Western liberal democracy, suggesting that with the end of the Cold War, all of the important historical issues regarding the future of governance had been decided. Fukuyama's prediction soon proved wrong. As markets were further deregulated, the lot of workers and their communities declined. A pushback soon occurred, however, in the form of protests and strikes, some of which were aimed at new environmental and old race and gender issues. Neoliberal globalization entered a new and more volatile stage with the Great Recession in 2008, a crisis still unfolding. This crisis and its responses, seen also in Canada and Alberta, is why Polanyi's ideas continue to matter. As a benefit to you, I've listed on slide number 9 the website information for a short video dealing with Polanyi's ideas. The second part of today's lecture looks at forms of political authority. While there are various forms in this part of the lecture, I will look at primarily the roots of liberal democracy. The term liberal in this regard should not be confused with political labels such as liberal, conservative, or social democratic, all of which ascribe to certain basic tenets of liberalism, such as the protection of private property, the rule of law, individual civil rights, and suffrage. But as the next parts of this lecture will show, liberalism itself is comprised of 3 different and often competing elements: economic liberalism, political liberalism, and social liberalism. Slide number 11 briefly describes the roots of Western-style democracy going back to ancient Greece. The Greeks struggled with many of the issues we still struggle with today. Who should govern? Should only those with money or position have a say? This was the case in Athens, where women and slaves were excluded, much as in the United States until the Civil War, and in the case of women in most Western countries until the end of the First World War. Can the rabble be trusted with making decisions? What if they're led astray by slick-tongued blowhards and conmen? The power of oratory was a noted element of Athenian politics. How should the will of the people be decided? Should people, those allowed to vote, decide matters directly or through their representatives? Direct democracy is a fine idea in small towns, perhaps, where people can turn up at a town hall. But how would that work in a country such as Canada, with 35 million people strung out across the territory? But if left to representatives, how should they be selected? Should representations be made by people with a degree of expertise in order to sort out the issue? Or should they be generalists, just sort of regular folk? In one way or another, the ancient Greeks dealt with these issues without, just as today, without arriving at any firm answers to any of these questions. Slide number 12 portrays Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes comes along at a time when the modern state is emerging. We've already discussed some of this earlier. The modern state was territorially larger and with much larger populations than city-states, raising issues of governance and power that were becoming quite clear in Hobbes' time. Slide number 13 highlights Hobbes' key ideas about power and the preferred means of exercising sovereign power. Hobbes views society as a contest between individuals, each of whom seeks more power through either their natural or acquired instrumental abilities. This pursuit of power holds the possibility of endless conflict, a perpetual war of all against all, whereby life becomes, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, end of quotes. To save themselves from this ill fate, Hobbes argues that people willingly surrender their personal authority and autonomy to a sovereign, either the king or parliament. The sovereign, the state, provides the basis for human social survival. Unanswered by Hobbes, however, is how, on what basis, is it determined that people give up their autonomy and to whom they give it. Slide number 14 links, I hope provocatively, the notion of the state and God. For in Hobbes' time, the power of the church was under increased scrutiny by a growing intellectual and merchant class. Secular thought was on the rise. Consider for the moment this idea. The notion of God is one of an omnipotent but unseen entity who has the power of life and death over his, nearly always his, subjects. And God is eternal. He exists before one is born and will live on after one dies. Consider then also the state. The state is also omnipotent, that is, all-powerful, but it also is unseen. This is the nature of abstract entities, including God, which gives abstractions a particular power. The state also has the power of life and death over its subjects, or through warfare over citizens elsewhere, through weapons that increasingly come out of nowhere, like thunderbolts. And the state seems eternal, outliving its subjects. In a secular age, the state then becomes the perfect substitute for God, while also having more material power through technology. Something to think about. Slide number 15 portrays John Locke and his central ideas. Locke made several important contributions to the economic and political parts of liberalism. First, he argues for a radical notion of the individual, sovereign and quite independent from social restraints, a bourgeois notion of the self fitting the move from feudal to modern notions. Second, along this line, he also provides a defense of private property, as before this time, most productive property was held in common. Third, you will note his defense of certain civil rights to life, liberty, and again, possessions. If these words seem to echo those of the American Constitution, it should be no surprise, as Locke's greatest influence was in the Americas. In this regard, note too that his concept of private property rested on the idea of taking it from unspoiled and undeveloped nature, a defense that justified American colonists taking unsettled land from the continent's indigenous peoples. Note also Locke's justification for rebellion. Similar words also found a home in the US Declaration of Independence. And finally, note Locke's discussion of labor as a commodity. We have seen earlier Marx's denunciation of the alienating aspect of capitalist production. For Locke, however, the ability to willingly alienate one's labor, to stand outside of it, selling it, was a positive and provides the basis for a capitalist labor market. Besides highlighting two of Gary Cooper's more famous Hollywood films of long ago, slide number 16 suggests again something of Locke's relationship to American political culture. High Noon is the story of a lone individual standing up against the mob. It's a familiar American story repeated by Clint Eastwood and others, a mythic morality tale about the individual. The Fountainhead, the book, was written by Ayn Rand, a libertarian philosopher whose influence remains high in Republican circles in the US and among a minority in Canada. Slide number 17 gives you portraits of Jeremy Bentham and James Mill. Slide 18 portrays their particular ideas. Bentham and Mill return to the notion of how to determine the will of the people, realizing that the people to be consulted were male property owners. The means of doing it, said Bentham, was to have universal suffrage based on education with short but regular sessions of parliament that would keep a check on the sovereign, that is, the government. A further check, said Bentham and Mill, was to ensure minimal government. To Locke's primary focus on economic liberalism, Bentham and Mill were now adding substantially to the basic notions of political liberalism. Slide number 19 portrays John Stuart Mill and his ideas. John Stuart Mill, James's son, expanded the political realm and expanded the notion of rights. He defended individual liberty, general suffrage, and women's rights, and opposed slavery, and also wrote of social rights. Of particular interest today, perhaps, he also defended the notion of just war, an idea that Democrats and Republicans in the US and liberals and conservatives in Canada have used in recent decades to justify military interventions in various parts of the world, with unfortunately far from positive outcomes. Slide number 20 deals with some key issues of C.B. Macpherson, a major Canadian political theorist who questioned the notion of liberalism as we understand it, and argued that the three types of liberalism have internal contradictions that limit the expression of democracy. As noted above, economic liberalism was defined first in the 17th and 18th centuries. Its defense of individual and private property in particular puts limits on the other types. That is, because it comes along first, the other forms coming afterwards are already strictured to some degree. Political liberalism came next in the 19th century. This was the time of suffrage, the gaining of the vote, gradually becoming part of the political systems in the West. But it also still, as a result of economic liberalism's pull, still holds as a value the defense of private property. Social liberalism arose primarily after the Second World War, but note that rights to housing, healthcare, education, and other provisions constantly face limits opposed by the economic system. The provision of social rights, social liberalism, is in some sense residual to the other forms of liberalism. Macpherson argues that economic liberalism allows finance capital to intrude on the aims of political liberalism by essentially buying politicians and policies that ensure its protection and further growth. As its wealth increases, so also does finance capital's political clout. Finance capital is also able by this means to decide where money will be spent socially. Decision-making again depends on the whims and interests of those with money. Summarized in the slide, economic liberalism means that $1 equals one vote in the marketplace, while political liberalism means one vote a person equals one vote at the ballot box. There are endless examples of this because the state is dependent upon corporate capital for investments, including jobs and taxes. Governments regularly do things that will make capital happy, and unhappy capital, unlike workers, is much better able to leave the country. Most of the major political scandals of recent decades, Lavalin, Bombardier, Enron, Goldman Sachs, has involved too close of a relationship between political parties and governments and the corporate sector, that is, finance capital. This brings lecture number 5 to a close. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you have any questions, for sure, please send me emails and I will attempt to answer them. In the meantime, all the best.